Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1, your Santa Fe public radio station. Today, I'll be speaking with Robert Jensen, an author, blogger, and an environmental activist. With Wes Jackson, he is the co-author of An Inconvenient Apocalypse: Environmental Collapse, Climate Crisis, and the Fate of Humanity. It's a big topic. And he publishes a most compelling blog that's detailing kind of his personal relationship or experience of the unfolding climate crisis. We will get to Bob in just a moment, but first a few short announcements. I had Bob on the show a little over 3 weeks ago, and despite that interview going for a full hour, there were questions that I had on my mind that we never discussed. And so I've invited Bob back, and we'll get back to him in just a minute. Last week, I interviewed Marielle Nanasi, Executive Director and Lead Attorney for New Energy Economy. Joining her on the show was Gary Coffin, an attorney, one of the co-founders of Indivisible Albuquerque. We spoke about the PRC's possible reconsideration of the Avangrid PNM merger, something that New Energy Economy, Retake Our Democracy, and Indivisible Albuquerque all vigorously oppose. And I just want to interject that there was good news yesterday on Wednesday. This is Saturday, but the show is being recorded on Thursday. So on Wednesday, the PRC announced that they had made a mistake. They were wrong. Marielle Nanasi and New Energy Economy were correct, and they apologized, and they said that they were going to, and if they were withdrawing from their suit with Avangrid to the Supreme Court, asking that their appeal be withdrawn so that they could then have a new hearing, a very truncated new hearing with no new evidence. And that was just not something that was okay. It was not legal. And PRC basically acknowledged that. So that was a great win for us. I also want to remind you that if you are listening to this show while driving around town and you miss any of the show, when you get home, you can go to Retake on the Radio, retakeourdemocracy.org, and then click on Retake on the Radio, and a recording of this show and all our prior shows will be there available for you. And we take a great deal of pride in the selection of our guests and curating guests. And so there's a lot of good shows there. So when you land there to listen to Robert, maybe check out the first interview with Robert first, and then listen to this one, and then poke around and see if there's other interesting people you might want to listen to. Because I suspect there are. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air. Okay, let's get started. Bob, I'm very excited about doing the second interview. It's good to have you.
Yeah, it was so much fun the first time. I'm really glad to be back. Thanks, Paul.
And we're both in matching t-shirts, I think, really close to matching t-shirts. So even though you were on the show just 3 weeks ago, we likely have some new listeners today. So I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a moment and tell us who you are, how you got involved in podcasting and writing about environmental issues.
So I'm a retired college teacher. I was at the University of Texas for 26 years. Before that, I was a newspaper journalist, and was lucky at the age of 60 to be able to retire and start spending more of my time on work with a man named Wes Jackson, co-founder of the Land Institute and an important figure in the environmental education movement as well as the sustainable agriculture movement. And Wes and I have been collaborating on books for ordinary people, not necessarily for environmentalists, books that aren't primarily technical in orientation, but books that try to grapple with what is coming, what Wes and I like to call the multiple cascading ecological crises, and what we might do about it, how to think about it. For me, this comes after a lot of work on issues we generally would call social justice, feminist critiques of male dominance, critiques of white supremacy, critiques of U.S. militarism. I've been kind of an all-purpose lefty, I guess you could say, in my adult life.
Sounds like me. So maybe we'll have to get together someday. Um, so one of the things we discussed last time is that it is time to begin to shift our strategy from preventing the climate crisis and mitigation to
Adapt.
actually getting ready for adaptation to what
Yeah.
is inevitably coming. And you had alluded to that when we were talking a
Yeah.
little bit before we got on. Can you talk a little bit about why you
Yeah.
think it's time to think about adaptation instead of mitigation and prevention and what that looks like?
Yeah. I would also, you know, focus on the limits of adaptation even. So in the environmental movement, we're used to people focusing on policy changes, developing more electric vehicles, shutting down coal-fired plants, all sorts of things that have useful and important impacts immediately. Uh, what Wes and I would say is that even if most of those initiatives were successful, we're still looking at a major shift in the human presence on this planet. Now, that's not a popular position because, of course, when you talk about a major shift, you're talking about incredible human suffering, more and more intense ecological destruction. But Wes and I believe, as I think more and more people do, that some of that is inevitable, not because we humans can't make choices, but because there are forces in motion and systems in place that are going to make it pretty much impossible to stave off what is commonly called collapse. And I
Can
think
I
that,
just interrupt for a second and ask you
sure,
if you've ever read any of Dar Jamal's
yeah.
books? He's
In
been a
fact,
guest a couple times, and he
yeah,
takes very much that same perspective that we're
yeah,
cooked. It's all cooked, baked into the
yeah.
Arctic and stuff, and there's nothing we can do about it. We've got to start adapting.
Well, there are things we can do about it, but what we can't do about it is at this point in time wish ourselves into an ecologically sustainable planet for 8 billion people. And I think Dar is right about that. Dar is a friend, someone I met back in the anti-war movement when he was doing excellent work on Iraq. And his book, The End of Ice, I think is a really important read, partly for the reporting, but also for the emotional honesty of it. Dar is quite an exceptional person and an exceptional writer. So, again, what I like to remember is that there's a lot of variation in the human species. Some people really need to work on something that can perhaps have concrete results today or tomorrow or within the next decade. And I don't want to argue that people who feel that way should abandon what they're doing. But what Wes and I wrote about in our book, An Inconvenient Apocalypse, is the need to also start thinking about the longer term. If, in fact, 8 billion people on the planet living at something like the current level of aggregate consumption, if that's simply unsustainable, meaning it can't go on for much longer, maybe years, decades at the most, then we are looking at this, what West calls a downpowering, a move from a high energy, high technology society to the consumption of considerably less energy and material resources. Well, the problem is for a lot of us, we don't have the skills. We don't live in societies that are built for that. And so it's important to start thinking about it now. Wes has a particularly useful perspective on it more than me because he was born on a Depression era small family farm in Kansas. He was born into a culture in which frugality was the highest virtue, not necessarily because you were so virtuous, but because you didn't have many other options. Wes grew up in one of those kind of low energy worlds where every time you used a resource, you had to think hard about it. So Wes brings that direct experience into this conversation, and I think it's really important. He's doing some new writing about that kind of question. So again, I don't like to preach at people. I don't think anybody has definitive answers, but I do think the data is quite clear that not only on climate change, but on those other multiple cascading crises, soil erosion, soil degradation, chemical contamination, biodiversity loss, the extinction crises, all of these indicate that 8 billion people living in high energy, high technology societies are simply not sustainable. Now, it's important to recognize the current consumption is not equitably distributed across the world, obviously.
Yes.
So there needs to be a focus on not only how to transition into a low energy world, but how to try to do it with as much humanity as we can manage. And of course, the current political and economic systems are not set up for that. That's why we need to talk forthrightly, even though a lot of people find it, frankly, quite depressing to talk this way. If that's our reality, depressing or not, you don't solve problems by ignoring reality.
No, you don't. And we're getting very good at ignoring reality. So one of the other things that you mentioned when we spoke last week was and you've alluded to it a little bit here, but it's not that the electrification of cars is
Mm,
going to solve our problems or
yeah,
even begin to solve our problems.
yeah,
And that what you envision is that there's the need to divorce from the car culture, the individual car culture, and begin to look towards,
yeah.
public transportation as an alternative. And it seems to me that to get to that point where we're ready to do that, there are two major changes that have to happen. And first, the technical one is just to create a network of fast electric trains that connect um, communities across the country, because inevitably people are going to need to travel across the country, and jets aren't an option.
Mhm.
And but the and that's a technical an investment problem that is solvable. I suspect you might suggest that even that is going too far. But the larger change, I think, is in the culture, because people don't like public transportation, from what I can tell. And they like to be able to go where they want to go, when they want to go there, and in their own comfort. And that's a very American individualism kind of thing. And you could create all of these great public transportation systems, but if you don't have people who are willing to use them, where have we gotten? So
Yeah.
how do you see us being able uh, to
Mhm.
attack both of those challenges?
Well, first of all, I don't want to seem negative about electric vehicles or people who buy them. Some of my best friends have electric vehicles. What Wes and I would say is we have to recognize the limits of the technological solution of, as they often say, electrifying everything. That gets us closer to where we need to be, but still a long way from a sustainable human presence on the planet. So uh, I'm all for developing better electric vehicles that can be built cheaper and used more widely. I'm also for mass transit. I actually have lived in a couple of different cities that had viable mass transit, subway and bus systems. And I can tell you it really improves one life when you don't have to pull your car out to get across town. So people like mass transit, in my experience, when it's functional and it's affordable. And when those conditions are met, people use mass transit uh, in great numbers. Go look at the New York City subway system.
Right.
Okay. But I think what I'm saying is that more important than electrifying vehicles or even expanding mass transit is moving around less, lowering our expectations for travel. If you think about it, what we take as normal, that is, we in the affluent world who have access to enough money for these transportation technologies, getting in the car and driving all day to get to a destination is nothing. Getting on a plane to go halfway around the world is nothing. Well, I think rather than think about how can we do that in more environmentally friendly ways, which is important, more important is to think about how to stop doing that. This kind of mobility has not been part of human evolutionary history for very long, and we're going to have to get used to not moving around as much. Now, I'm older, I'm retired, and I found that not traveling as much as I used to is actually a great relief. But let me make it as concrete as possible. I have out in my field a 1994 Ford Ranger pickup. Uh, I drive it so little I can't even tell you how many miles to the gallon it gets. It's a 30-year-old truck. Now let's say I drive that truck 1,000 miles a year. Right? Okay, then let's compare that to buying a new electric truck, but it's so spiffy I end up driving it 10,000 miles a year. Which is the better deal for me, for my community, for the ecosystems. Well, that's where, Wes used to make this point. We have to think about not only what is more efficient, but what is sufficient. You know, if I can sufficiently live my life by traveling only 500 miles a year, driving down to Santa Fe to get a part for something every now and then, but I give up on the idea of driving across the continent to visit my friends in New York City. I find other ways to stay connected to people, right? Well, then it seems to me trying to electrify everything, trying to make that kind of long distance travel easier is not necessarily the ecologically sustainable path. I'm not, again, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying there's a single answer to any of this, but we have to start talking about limits. And that's the one thing I think you're right, especially in the United States, it's very difficult to talk about limits. It's not only that conservatives don't like limits, they think everybody should be free to do whatever they want. Look at the dialogue in the liberal and left political mainstream. Do you see the most leftist politicians in Congress standing up and saying, I'm going to run on a platform of cutting everybody's material consumption in half, community imposed limits? Well, nobody argues for that because it's politically not a winner at the moment, but that's where we're going to have to go. And for anybody who wants to see how this could actually work out, I recommend the work of a colleague, Stan Cox. Stan has written a couple of good books on rationing and downpowering, how we can actually do it, how there is policy that is viable. Now, of course, there's no political will for that right now, but reading that work of Stan's is really helpful in imagining how it could work.
And what was the name of that book again?
Stan has a book on rationing called Any Way You Slice It, which goes back a few years, in which he points out that rationing is a viable way to collectively control our consumption. And his most recent book is called A Path to a Livable Future, where he talks about some work he's done with a colleague of his about how to gradually reduce energy consumption by hard limits that are, again, collectively determined and collectively imposed. Because we all know that, you and I making an individual choice to live on less energy, while admirable and a good thing, is not a solution. We're a social animal, we're a herd animal, and if we don't do these things together, if we don't employ, mutual coercion to make sure that we stick to the rules, there's not really much hope. Now, of course, I'm sure there are people listening saying, well, what about the 1%? What about the billionaires? Who's going to control them? And I understand exactly, which is why the political will must be built not only to go after that really obscene maldistribution of wealth, which I think is obscene, but to think then about how do we not only eliminate billionaires. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to go off with my shotgun at them, but eliminate the concept of billionaires. And then also move from that to imposing limits on those of us who are in the middle class, who consume well beyond any sustainable level.
I'm very interested in finding out more about those books because part of what I'm wrestling with is the whole concept of moving from conceptually what we must do to pragmatically how do we do that. And that usually involves both technical solutions, political solutions, and social solutions. So I'm guessing that Mr. Cox's book addresses those concepts.
Yeah, I want to put in another plug for Stan because he's one of my real North Stars in this. Stan is a plant breeder. He works at the Land Institute where Wes is, and he started his career as an agricultural scientist, but he also started developing a social political analysis. And his work, which is also available online for free, really goes to the heart of what Wes and I call in our book technological fundamentalism, this idea that new technology is going to solve all our problems. And Stan is a very careful scientist, a good analyst of data. And so I really, in fact, read Stan's book before you read mine. Stan's smarter than I am. So Stan Cox, COX, he's a real treasure.
Well, all right. Well, thank you. It's not often we have guests recommending other people's books before theirs.
Yeah.
Um, so, we've been hodgepodging around a little bit on this
Mhm.
issue, and in doing so, we've sort of answered a bunch of the questions I have lined up here. And so, but one of the things I wanted to ask you is it the case that I mean, you sort of answered this, but could you imagine a system where, let me think how to put this. Let's say in New Mexico, we just recently had our legislative session closed,
Mhm.
and one of the few good things they got done was they created a capacity for local communities to manage their water.
Mhm.
Um, and I I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, would there be a way for a state to offer counties funding to set up? Because what you're talking about for these saving remnants is groups that would be more like a kibbutz or a commune, 10, 20, 30
Mhm.
families or adults working together. And in some fashion, if it's left up to individuals just to do that on their own volition, that's you're going to get a certain number of people who will gravitate that way. My son is probably one of them. But would it be possible for the state to foster a system like that so that counties got money to help smaller population groupings, whether it's by precinct or
Yeah.
by neighborhood or what have you, um, to collectively work together to create an adaptation plan. And then they submit that plan, and with that plan, they get money and land and technical support to set up one of those communities.
Sure.
Can you imagine something like that being effective? And are you aware of any state that's doing anything even remotely like that?
A lot of cities, states are starting to um, study and adopt these kind of resiliency plans, and I think that's all to the good. Certainly, government has the power to rethink how we use public money and public land, and all of that's possible. I also think it's unlikely, in the short term at least, that's going to be the sort of sharp edge of the spear going forward on this. I think it's going to probably start with private people working in cooperative arrangements, often through nonprofit groups. Let me give you an example. There's a group called the Land Stewardship Project in Minnesota, and one of the things they're starting to do is identify older farmers who perhaps don't have children or their children don't want to continue farming. But these are farmers with deep connections to their land, and they want to see that land continue to be used productively and sustainably. They're connecting those kind of folks with younger farmers who have energy and knowledge but don't have the capital, right? And so there's all sorts of ways that people who really care about the land can come together and deal with this, bizarre economic system we've created. And of course, governments can, create tax breaks and all sorts of things that make that more attractive. Uh, I wish we were already, years ahead on these kind of projects, because my fear is that when things start to fray at a more intense and speedy level, right, where things really start to fall apart quickly, this kind of careful planning is going to be difficult to do. Uh, but there are, all sorts of places where you can see already doing. For instance, I'm part of an acequia association here in northern New Mexico, and tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. we have another of our communal ditch cleaning days. And anybody who's ever worked with the acequias knows there really is an incredible example of collaborative, cooperative community work. Everybody also knows all it takes is one, unpleasant member of the Acequia Association to make trouble. Human beings aren't perfect. There's no way to set up a perfect system, but when we're in it together, I think history tells us we're more likely to be successful. After all, that is our evolutionary history. Small band level foraging societies, 50, no more than 100 people. That's the level we adapted into this, planet dominating species. And I think we're going to end up back there. The question is, can we do it humanely, and can we do it with as little ecological destruction as possible?
and economic and social equity.
Yeah.
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 We're going to have to close the radio show, unfortunately, but we'll continue this conversation for a few minutes.
Mhm.
Um, and it'll be recorded on YouTube and available at retakeourdemocracy.org. Just click on Retake on the Radio. It'll be there by the time the show ends on Saturday morning. Miracles.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to take a 10-second or 5-second silence break so that the radio station knows we're done,
Okay.
and then we'll continue this conversation. Well, I need to close the radio show though. And so this is Paul Gibson at retakeourdemocracy.org and on Retake on the Radio on KSFR. And next week, we're going to have Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard on the show. And we're going to be talking to her about how she and the Land Commission were one of the only winners in the legislative session when it comes to climate. And so we'll be back next week with that show. And the show after that is going to be Roxanne and I giving our update on the future direction of Retake Our Democracy. So stick with us.
Great.
Got to stay active. You got to stay engaged. It's the only way we fix this mess. We'll be back next week. Take care of yourselves. Okay, I'm back by the miracle of YouTube recording. And Bob, I wanted to pursue, you had mentioned something a while ago in today's interview, that, historically we didn't live by going,
Mhm.
thousands of miles or even hundreds of miles, perhaps even scores of miles to do anything.
Yeah.
You lived in a little cluster and families lived there for generations. Um, and, we're not there right now. So in this transition period, you had described your experience or your
Yeah.
situation with your truck. And does it make more sense for you to just, drive 1,000 miles a year and reduce your travel, um, instead of buying an expensive electric vehicle?
Yeah.
And, our situation is a little different. And I think a lot of people my age and our age, we have grandchildren,
Mhm.
2,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And, we see them at most once a year, except on Zoom. And so for us, our thinking is we get a nice sedan, electric sedan, and we drive to Cleveland maybe twice a year. But there's no, airlines involved, and there's no carbon involved, except in the production of the car itself. And at least that way we're able to sustain that relationship. I think at the point that if we get down to what you're projecting after the collapse, where most all of the surviving communities are in these little clusters, then we would probably maybe gravitate back to the way we are probably supposed to live, like in these little tribes or kibbutzim, um, and where children don't just go off for a job opportunity in New York, they stay in that community. Is that sort of the thing you're
Yeah.
expecting in the future?
Yeah. So there's a period in which we have choices. And before too long, there will be a period in which we don't have choices. And I think this is a good example of that. So, as you point out, in 20th century America, especially post World War II America, it was not unusual for people to take advantage of this mobility, move halfway around the country, leave family, and have the ability to still stay connected. Right? And so we live in social situations where we want that. We want to be able to go back for, a grandchild's wedding or a funeral. And right now, if you have enough, wealth, you can do that. But what I'm suggesting is there's going to be a time when that isn't possible.
Right.
And it's better that we start talking about collectively imposed limits that are collective, both in how they're designed and how we enforce them. And maybe, for a while, everybody gets one airplane trip a year, and then we phase out air travel. but it's quite clear that the mobility today that we take for granted, just think about the expectations for vacations that have become pretty normal. Cruise lines, I still don't understand why anybody wants to get on a boat and float around, but people want to do it. Theme parks, how much of the current economy is based on affluent people? And by affluent people, I don't just mean the 1% or the billionaires. I mean middle class America. How much of the economy depends on that mobility and that discretionary spending on, what we call a vacation? Well, that's not going to be part of a human future in a low energy, limited technology world. And we might as well start thinking about it. As I said, I've retired from my job teaching. And of course, as you get older, it's easier, I think, to stay put. But what I've learned is that while for 30 years, I traveled a great deal, both around the US and internationally, the connections I made to people were amazing. I still have good friends all over the world that are a result of that travel. There's a certain excitement that comes with being able to do that. But I'm also realizing now that I'm here in northern New Mexico and I stay put. I literally don't go anywhere. I don't travel for the most part. There's a certain kind of satisfaction and reward in that. It's different than the being able to get on a plane and fly over to India and spend time with my friend and do lectures and all that. That was great part of my life. But I'm learning how quickly I accepted that as the standard for excitement. And there's a different kind. I'm not sure excitement is the right word, but I'm excited every year when the ditch starts running and we start irrigating in the acequia system. I get excited about that. I think we're going to have to learn that much of what we've been sold as excitement is simply not going to be available, and we have to find other ways to live a meaningful life.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to give you an example, Roxanne and I get completely absorbed in the legislative process,
Mm-hmm.
and everything that makes any sense in terms of human social health, anything like that just gets set aside so that you can focus on getting the job done. But as soon as it was over, we pivoted because we have a large vegetable garden
Mm-hmm.
and in a bunch of beds and so forth. And there's always prep to do out there.
Yeah.
And, we had a shed we had to build because we've got to store stuff. And we built the shed last week and we prepared all the gardens and got them all ready for when the frost is over. And when we get back in the house, we'd be like, just, I don't want to say delirious, but it was like exultant. We had, look what we did. And there's something really gratifying about it. And then I'm sitting here right now and I'm seeing the daffodils come up and outside my window. And that's an annual event. And those kinds of things are the kinds of things I think you're talking about in terms of getting some excitement out of the place it's place-based excitement,
Yeah.
And we have gotten away from that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like titillation is what gets us going.
Yeah, and I think we're also going to have to rethink the concept of work. So I was born in 1958, and I was born into a generation in a social position where it was assumed that you wanted to get an education so you could escape from any kind of manual labor. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a blacksmith, worked with his hands his whole life. My father went into business. I went into teaching and journalism. And that's seen by most people as progress, right? But I think what a lot of folks are realizing, and again, my co-author Wes Jackson has really helped me understand this as someone who came from farm country, grew up working on a farm, also, got higher education and did a lot of other things. But that satisfaction you're talking about in working with our hands and our bodies and our minds, because remember, when we do manual labor, we're not robots, we're thinking.
Right.
When you watch skilled tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, contractors work, it's really, for someone like me who doesn't have those skills, it's an extraordinary thing to watch how they think through problems, solve problems, and then implement those solutions with their hands and their bodies. And I think we have to learn to find new ways to take pleasure in that. Now, I don't want to be naive. I know lots of people who did really hard manual labor their whole lives and their bodies suffered for it. But I also see, generations of kids who think that work really is simply pushing pixels around on a screen, digital employment. And
Exactly.
I feel sorry that they haven't had that experience. Again, not to wax nostalgic, but one of the things I'm most grateful for, I grew up in North Dakota and I grew up before the era of snowblowers, which meant that my brothers and I shoveled snow. And I learned a lot as a very young kid about what it meant to take pride in work by doing something as simple as shoveling the driveway and shoveling the sidewalk, and knowing that that was my job and that the family depended on me to do that. And I think people who've been lucky enough to have those kinds of experiences, and I think you see it most dramatically in farm families where that kind of labor is just essential. Um, I think there's something that I'm certainly grateful for, uh, and I worry about younger people who don't have that opportunity, not because they're lazy and I'm an old guy who's going to tell them, but because they've lacked the opportunity to develop those skills and that pride.
It's interesting you say that because when I was in high school, if a student was taking a shop class,
Mhm.
that suggested they were kind of a
Yeah,
loser. They were going to go
yeah,
to community college.
yeah,
They had no future. And
yeah,
that was the culture. And
yeah,
that was the kind of values that dominated most high schools in
yeah,
the 60s and the 50s and 60s and
yeah,
70s and probably to this day.
yeah,
Although it's starting to change a little bit, at least
yeah,
here in Mexico. And I think that I was deprived, as it is, Roxanne is the
yeah,
one who figures out how to do what we need to do. And then
yeah,
she just points me in the direction and shows me
yeah,
what to do. I have no instincts on any of
yeah.
that.
And
And
it's a reminder how important culture is.
mhm,
So again, going back to my friend Wes Jackson, he grew up in a culture where that kind of work was expected, and the creativity that came with, repairing a barn with used materials instead of just, going off to Home Depot and buying everything new. Those were virtues that were celebrated in the community. Right? Now, when you lose that, it's not easy to get it back quickly. You can watch a YouTube video to figure out how to fix, the broken toilet tank or something. But that cultivating the ability to look at problems, solve problems, and take pride in your ability to solve those problems cheaply, that's a cultural reality. I mentioned my grandfather was a blacksmith. He had an enormous wealth of knowledge about tools, metal, wood, all sorts of things. But because my father wasn't interested, I never learned it. And in one generation, an incredible store of knowledge about how to deal with materials was lost. And I
mhm,
have learned how hard it is to get it back. And I'm not blaming my father or my grandfather for imposing that on us. We're talking about social forces, cultural realities. And
absolutely.
that's why we have to talk openly about this. I talk about the the enjoyment that comes with my work on the ditch, the acequia, all the time, to try and remind people in my life that this isn't something I'm doing because, oh, I have to. I'm doing it because I take pride in it and I see it as a contribution to the community.
I get it. I get it. As we're talking, I'm just thinking it's too bad that this interview isn't more interactive with people,
Hmm.
who are going to be listening to this. And I'm wondering if going forward we might be able to work something out where we do
Yeah.
these things called webinars,
Uh-huh.
Zoominars,
Yeah.
and we get people like you up and that we talk for 45 minutes to an hour with Roxanne and I offering the kinds of questions I've been offering today, having this kind of conversation. And then we invite anywhere from 80 to 300 people who sign on,
Uh-huh.
like, have at it, let's talk about this,
Yeah.
and engage you and engage me and engage each other in discussion of it, because this is tough stuff. It's
Uh-huh.
I think you're 100% right. It's coming whether we're ready for it or not.
Yeah.
and I have no idea. I wish I did, of what is required politically, or social movement
Mhm.
wise, to get people to recognize what we have to do. Do
Yeah.
you have any idea how we do that?
Well, I think again, I refer so often to my friend Wes Jackson because he's been such a powerful influence on me. But my immediate reaction was about storytelling. So Wes is many things. He's, a great organizer, a great thinker, a great writer, but he's primarily a great storyteller. And he's got a way of narrating some of that experience from the past, from the Depression, from that small farm. Small things that are really powerful. For instance, uh, we know that today's agriculture is large scale and typically monocultures. You go up to Iowa, and you see mile after mile of nothing but corn, nothing but soybeans. Well, Wes grew up on a small family farm, and I asked him once, how many crops did you plant in a year? And he said he's actually got records that his father kept, and they had as many as 20 or 25 crops in a single year. The diversity was their protection. If the strawberries failed, there were the melons. They had animals, and just stories about that diversity really make it come alive. Wes right now he loves to collect what he calls kind of the remnants of the industrial era tools and things that were once essential to building like an industrial machine. And then he tells stories about them. But I think, you know, political organizing is important. Trying to affect the policy at the legislature is important. But when you talk about remaking a culture, that happens in a much less organized and direct way. And
Absolutely.
and I think those stories are crucial. Uh, and and I've been lucky to work with, one of the great storytellers, which is why we did a podcast series. We did 7 interviews I conducted with Wes that are available on the line. They're called Podcasts from the Prairie. And mostly it was me, poking Wes to tell another story about how he came to to fashion the ecological worldview he has, and how he came to realize the industrial worldview was a dead end. And so in the big picture with the big ideas, the ecological versus the industrial, it all comes alive through experience and stories. And I think that's what's crucial. Um, we have incredible storytelling vehicles in all of this digital media, but I hold out for the importance of people, as you were pointing out, being in the same place, uh, and sharing human interaction that is face to face. I don't want to deny the power of digital media, social media, mass media. But when I think back on my own life, the most powerful influences have been those people I could spend time with face to face.
Right, right. But again, as you're talking about, the expectations for this new world,
Hmm.
some of that is going to have to go away.
Yeah,
And so you and Wes may wind up on
yeah,
Zoom more than
yeah,
in the living room together.
yeah. Uh, and you have to learn to live where you are. I think of one of Wes's good friends, the novelist Wendell Berry. Uh, Wendell has been an advocate for place, for recognizing the power of place. In his case, it's in rural Kentucky. Wendell also is a very popular speaker and lecturer, and so he, for a long time, traveled a bit. And he used to joke, "I'm the guy who goes all over the world telling people to stay home." And that's the reason I like that is it captures uh, the irony, the trap we're all in. Wendell wants to advocate for a new way of thinking about what it means to be home. And to do that, he travels more than he wants to. But at some point, we're all going to have to learn to live where we are. And and again, there's there's a wealth of exciting things to learn where you are. I keep mentioning the acequia system because I'm relatively new here, and I'm really enjoying learning about the history of our acequia association. So every time we're out cleaning the ditch, the couple weeks every spring where we do that, I'm asking the older folks, the people who've lived here their whole lives, questions, and getting them to tell the stories. And that's how I learn about how the system works. It's how I learn about where I live now. In my old age, I'm 64. I'm starting to take very seriously the obligation to learn about where I am. And it reminds me of something Wendell Berry said. He said, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are, right? And I think that's a really powerful, I was going to say command, but that's a little too authoritarian. It's a powerful suggestion to remember that the excitement isn't in New York City. The excitement isn't in Paris. There's lots of exciting things to do all over the world, including wherever you live. And that's what I'm taking to heart here in New Mexico.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time for this conversation.
Yeah.
And can you let our listeners know where they can find more information about you and Wes?
Yeah. The easiest way is just to put my name in a search engine, and my page will be the first one that comes up, as long as you spell my last name right, Jensen. And I'd like to also recommend a website of a friend's project. It's called the New Perennials Project, run by Bill Vitek, a longtime collaborator of Wes Jackson as well. Bill is a philosophy professor turned community activist. And the New Perennials Project details the work he's doing in Vermont. And it includes a free publishing platform where you can get work that Wes and I have done, as well as a number of other short, accessible works that really provoke thought about the future. So search for New Perennials Project and especially take a look at their publishing work. Very exciting. This kind of stuff is going on all over the country, all over the world, and sharing it is very important.
Okay, well, we'll do our best. And I think after two conversations, I just think that Roxanne and I need to get our butts up to Taos at some point. We've got some friends up there that you may
Great.
know. Do you know Dan Pritchard?
I recently met Dan.
Okay, so and Christy, his wife.
Yeah, in fact, I saw them yesterday at an event at the library.
Okay, yeah, she's taken on a library role.
Yeah,
She was on our board. She's a good friend.
Yeah.
And Jay Levine.
Know the name, but haven't met him yet.
Okay, well, we'll have to get together one of these days. Good. Thank you very much, Les, and take care of yourself and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay,
Great pleasure. Bye-bye.